Welcome to CMC Research Institutes. We recently had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Niall Mac Dowell. He is a chartered engineer and faculty member at Imperial College London who leads the Clean Fossil and Bioenergy Research Group. His work is focused on interpreting how the world will transition to a low-carbon economy through the use of carbon capture and storage. We began the conversation by discussing why CCS is such a necessary technology to reduce carbon emissions.
So I guess the first thing is that CCS is not a technology. It's a suite of technologies, right? And this can be applied to power generation, whether it's combusting coal, oil, or natural gas, biomass, but also to the industrial sector. You can use it in the production of hydrogen from natural gas, and therefore you can use CCS as a means to deliver low carbon heat and low carbon mobility as well. So it really fits in everywhere, and in some senses, it provides a kind of path independence to a decarbonized outcome. So it allows you to use a much wider range of primary energy sources to achieve what we want. So that's one of the first things. And the second thing is that simply because we haven't moved fast enough on reducing emissions and decarbonizing, we're now in a space where we need to permanently remove CO2 from the atmosphere as well through this idea of negative emissions or greenhouse gas technologies. And there, the idea of geological carbon sequestration, CCS, again, plays an important role. So it sort of fits in everywhere. That's, I guess, why. Then, when you can sort of unpack this in a little bit more detail. And so, for example, a lot of the work that we do, my group, focuses in on the electricity system. And there, it's important to recognize, I think, that a national electricity system is a bit like a national financial system. The economy of Canada needs more than just dollars, right? So if you go to a bank, you can get multiple financial services. So, you get a current account and a short-term loan to buy a car and a mortgage to buy a house and all of the other kind of bits and pieces that we need to make the financial system work. The electricity system is the same. We need firm capacity so that we can be sure that we can, keep the lights on when we need it. We need power as and when we need it. But then we also need all of the ancillary services, which is really, quite a suite of ancillary services that thermal power plants provide traditionally. And all of this is required in order to deliver the kind of stable, reliable, always-on electricity system that we've come to rely on. And importantly, CCS can provide all of that. On top of that, CCS is inherently quite a flexible technology. And there, what I mean is by flexible, it can ramp up and down or turn on and off quite quickly. And what this allows us to do is to integrate more renewable energy into the grid than if we didn't have it as an option. So actually, the key point there is that CCS works with renewable energy, not against it. So it's really an and technology.
How can effective business models be developed to implement CCS, and how can businesses profitably embrace this energy transition? Because it's becoming obvious that it's something that we need to embrace, otherwise the environment is going to suffer further.
So I think, the way to think about this, at least from my perspective, is that we need to reimagine it from being just about cost to being about opportunities, right? There's always been this sort of resistance to change. Back in the 17th century, people came up with a new way of making socks, and the stockingers were against this. And then later we had the Luddites in the 19th century. And then when the motor car was sort of invented, there were concerns that it was going to basically wreck the agricultural economy. And every time that we've had these big changes, people have resisted it, right? And I think that they are pretty understandably concerned about losing their livelihoods, right? And in my view, a lot of the current resistance to, changing isn't all that different. And the Yellow Vest protest, the Gilets Jaunes, in France. I mean, a lot of that initially was concerned with people. It was just people that were concerned with the perceived regressive nature of fuel duty. So the idea was, we're going to make fuel more expensive, and therefore people will move to using public transport. Okay, that's fine if you live in a city, but a lot of people live in rural areas. They don't have access to public transport. So this is now, this is a problem for them. That was the origin of the Yellow Vests movement. So this tells us then that the transition to net zero, it really needs to be framed and addressed as an opportunity to make a progressive transition that improves quality of life across the board. So, yeah, we're going to stop burning, fossil fuels in cars, and you know what? This is great because air quality will improve. So, think about all of the plus sides, and there will be new jobs and new industries that will come out of this. The transition, of course, it will be new and difficult. There will be things to learn, right? But there's opportunity here. And I think that's one of the really important things that we need to think about. With CCS, there will be new pipelines to be built, new wells to be sunk, new industrial infrastructure to be built and deployed and owned and operated and financed. So every sector of the economy stands to benefit from the creation of this new infrastructure. And this works with every element of the net zero transition. And so therefore we need to focus on the upside, not exclusively be concerned about the downside.
Yeah, as we continue to innovate, that's job creation, and we're seeing the natural decline of the way that we're currently doing things, and we're amidst this transition. So of course it's going to be very scary, but it's repeated itself throughout history, so it's time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So since the world's energy systems are expected to continue to be dominated by fossil fuels for decades, how do we then explain to people who are less willing to embrace the transition that CCS is important? And how would you explain it to someone who either knows of it and is afraid of it, or who doesn't know about it at all?
So in some senses, you've answered the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
The world's energy is overwhelmingly supplied by fossil fuels, something like 82% in any average year of our total energy consumption is fossil energy. And this isn't going to change immediately or anything like immediately. But at the same time, we know that if we are to meet the terms of the Paris Climate Agreement, we only have a few decades to fully decarbonize the world's economy. And so, for example, Europe and the United Kingdom, for example, have firmly committed to net zero targets by 2050. So that gives us 3 decades. That's that's less than the lifetime of a big power plant, for example. So we don't have time to sort of let the fossil fuels run out, as it were, right? And so CCS lets us continue to exploit all of the advantages that fossil energy provides. I mean, fossil energy is amazing. A kilogram of coal contains a huge amount of energy, okay? And the services that this provides to society, and the wealth that fossil energy reserves provides to society in terms of royalty payments, which then go on to finance schools and roads and hospitals and so on. I mean, this allows our way of life to persist. And CCS allows us to have a transition to net zero that preserves and conserves both the natural environment, but also the human environment, the one that we need to. Now, when you use coal or natural gas to provide some kind of energy service, there are the CO2 or the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the combustion of that fuel at the power plant, let's say. But also you have the environmental damage that occurs upstream or downstream, rather. And so we also need to be concerned with that. But again, this is the creation of new industries, new economic activity, new jobs, and so on. And so therefore, this will ultimately be a good thing. As we grow the economy, sure, costs will go up, but if we do this right, you grow the economy at a rate greater than the increase of costs. So in real terms, low carbon energy becomes more affordable than the incumbent system, not less. And then don't forget of all the ancillary benefits around, improving air quality, for example. So this then reduces concerns around acid rain. It reduces air pollution, so therefore people get sick less. People get sick less. They spend less time in hospitals. They spend less time off work, and again, the economy grows. So there are benefits everywhere you look from this.
In one of your papers, you talked about how it is of vital importance that CCS technology operates synergistically with renewable power sources. And can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure. So first of all, renewable energy is fantastic, right? I mean, back in the late 80s, early 90s, when it started to be explored, the motivation was arguably primarily about energy security and about shielding us from price volatility associated with fossil fuel price variation. So it provides that primary service. It's also, a very, very low marginal cost source of energy. So that portion of it that we can economically use, and that will change and likely grow with time, we really ought to use, right? And why burn a finite fossil resource when you can use the infinite sun? So you should use it when it's available. And therefore, what we need to ensure is that the CCS technologies that we develop for in the context of the power systems, that they're flexible and dispatchable so that they can be there when the wind is not blowing and when the sun is not shining. So, for example, in Britain, we often have several, many days in the early part of the year when, the light's on, the heat, the lighting is on, the heating is on. Energy demand is really high, but there isn't that much sun in Britain in January, and we often get multi-day anticyclones. So these kinds of services to ensure system stability and resilience that can be economically and reliably provided by CCS technologies, they're absolutely imperative to delivering a resilient energy system. But then equally in May or June or July or whatever, when there is abundant sunshine, we need to be able to use that. And so this isn't to say that CCS is a technology that you turn on for 3 days and keep it off the rest of the year, but it can ramp up and ramp down and move to part load and full load, and it can do it, and it can do this quickly in the space of tens of minutes to go from full output to zero output. And again, you can work on this in a sort of the smart technology space, so as you can know, well, okay, we know that demand is going to go up or down now. We know from weather forecasts and so on that there's going to be more or less wind and some solar power available in the next hour. So therefore we can start working in a smart and synergistic way with this renewable resource to minimize costs to the consumer, which is fundamentally, really important, whether that consumer is a domestic consumer or an industrial consumer. So we minimize those costs whilst at the same time ensuring a resilient and stable supply of energy to actually keep the economy running, keep our society working.
Wow, that's so interesting. Thank you. Your answers are so fantastic and eloquent.
Thank you.
So in your opinion, how do we continue to push CCS development forward despite economic downturn and pandemic shutdowns? And I think we've touched on it a little bit already, but let's explore it a little more.
Sure. So I think that this is really important. There is certainly in Britain and in the European context, there's a lot of discussion around the Green New Deal in Europe, the Green Deal in Europe. And in Britain, we talk about focusing on green growth. We have a clear need in Britain to minimize or just to start clawing back the inequality between different regions within the United Kingdom, and also to improve the overall productivity of the country. So this can be done by the kinds of large infrastructural investments that will be required to kind of get the economy moving. So it's important to recognize the role that CCS and CCS infrastructure can play in that. So for example, in Britain, we have lots of, we've got a very well-established offshore oil and gas industry in the North Sea. CCS allows that industry to continue basically until the end of the century. Initially, whether it's capturing CO2 from power and industrial sources and ultimately taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and burying it in the North Sea. It's important that we know that this is a long-term stable way of securely storing CO2. It's not going to leak, and it's not sort of in the way. So this, I think, is really, really important, and it's important that we recognize that, this lets all sorts of people, like all kinds of jobs, all sectors of the economy, be involved in this recovery. It's not just one sector, and importantly, this can this creates sufficient jobs and sufficient output that it can then be done in the country, as opposed to sending investment money out of one's country to a third country where this technology might be manufactured. So you can do it locally, and you employ local people to deliver these results. And again, that's intrinsic to a progressive recovery from this pandemic.
Yeah, very true. And are you concerned that governments will cut or reduce funding in CCS because of everything that's been going on?
So I think that's always a concern. I think that in some senses, the balance between funding from government and funding from the private sector is really tricky and interesting, because most governments are basically in debt, right? They don't have capital. The capital sits in the private sector. So the idea that there is, an absence or a paucity of capital in the private sector, and we need the rich public sector to come in and pay for all this, is, I think, a bit of a nonsense, right? So, of course, the private sector I think reasonably don't want to take risks if they're not convinced that the public sector is fully committed to this investment. And the traditional way of ensuring that is to try and get the public sector to kind of invest in it, right? In the UK, our approach to dealing with the pandemic has been one of massive public investment. And so there is a spirit of that here and now. But beyond that, it's important, I think, to recognize that a government or a public sector that is maybe resource constrained can think of other ways that it can also support the deployment of these technologies. So, for example, acting as insurer of last resort to deal with some of the long-term liabilities and cross-chain risks associated with the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. I mean, this is something that will never actually cost them any money, but it allows the very significant reduction in the cost of financing, which then brings down the cost of the plants, and then lets them get built and lets us get going with this learning by doing. And this is sort of very important for the first phase of market creation. So I think that there are a lot of things that can be done to help create markets for these technologies that don't necessarily need to involve taking money from the public sector. Obviously, there's a role for financial support from the public sector, and I think it's really important that happens, so as the private sector has confidence that this support will be sustained. And in that context, then I think we need to really analyze and evaluate and communicate the cost benefit ratio and the positive benefit to cost ratio that CCS investments have in terms of job creation, job retention, productivity enhancement, and so on.
Great answer, thank you. And lastly, how do we continue to move forward in such, it's kind of repetitive, but in such uncertain economic times? Maybe let's just dig in deeper.
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess, part of it is, building on this question, we have an incumbent system. It's just been given a pretty significant shock. There has been a recession coming. I mean, this is all that anyone's been talking about for about 6 months, is that, the yield curve is inverted and so on. So we're expecting a downturn. It will have been exacerbated because of the COVID pandemic. So then the question is, well, okay, how do we move forward? We exploit what we already have. And again, recognizing that fossil energy provides a lot of the services that we rely on in our day-to-day life, but also, we have an economy that's been really hit. We have an industrial sector that needs to recover. So investing in the decarbonization of that industrial sector, for example, could be one really important way to achieve that outcome. It's also really important to recognize that the actions that will be most effective will vary quite significantly for economic and also for let's say social reasons and also political reasons in different parts of the world. So for example, in the UK, hydrogen is primarily a domestic heating question. In parts of Canada, it's much more an industrial question. In the UK and Europe, we're generally quite comfortable with concepts of public grants to get projects off the ground. In the North American context, things like tax credits, be they investment or production tax credits, that's a more usual approach. So there is no one-size-fits-all answer, but I think getting all the evidence we can about the value creation aspects of the transition and working toward those, I think, is what's most important.
Yeah, I would highly agree with that. And yeah, that's all for the list of questions that I had, but is there anything that you want to speak to that you feel I maybe didn't ask or missed out on here? Any speaking opportunities left?
Not really. I think what you've put together was really comprehensive. I think the thing that I would really want to focus in on is that the vast majority of evidence that's out there from the academic and so on sector, it's very technically focused, right? And here's a very low energy demand way of getting to our targets, or here's an approach that uses renewable energy only, or here's an approach that doesn't require greenhouse gas removal, and then so on. Anything that requires us to kind of vastly reduce our standard, or even in any way materially reduce our standard of living, I think is going to struggle to get accepted in sort of democratic countries, right? If it doesn't get a democratic mandate, then it won't be politically tenable, and politicians won't support it, and therefore our countries won't deliver it. If OECD countries like Britain and Canada and the United States and Europe don't deliver these technologies and deliver them quickly, then non-OECD regions absolutely will not. And therefore there's a real moral hazard almost about framing, when people frame the transition about one of cost and pain and reduction and avoid this and only do that. I think that there's a real moral hazard in that approach, and that you could wind up being the group that stop this transition, because it just won't be something that will be politically tenable in our part of the world, and it won't get off the ground in other parts of the world. So I think that it's really important to focus on the value creation and the growth opportunities, and to think about the ways in which we can engineer this transition, learning from the concerns people have had with transitions in past decades and centuries, and do it in a more sensible way.
How do you get past that, and how do we find common ground with one another when we are in democratic places, but we're kind of stepping on our own toes by being opposed to one another in that sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, one way to deal with that can be to try and identify regions of common ground, and try and start taking the useful steps that we can agree on. However, I think it's also really important not to be overly myopic about this. So if we only take the kind of the painless, easy steps based on what we can see right in front of us, this can wind up costing us a lot more in the long term. So in other words, it mortgages the future even more heavily than we already have. Yeah. So I think we need long-term vision, long-term commitment, and then this works for sort of humans as well as the private sector who need that kind of long-term certainty to take these kinds of multi-billion-dollar investment decisions. But you also need then to kind of build coalitions of the willing, as it were, where you've got common ground identified, and you can then say, okay, well, we might not agree on everything, but we can agree on this, so let's do that bit, and then build from there.
Thank you for watching our talk with Niall Mac Dowell, who offered us some incredible insight. Stay tuned for more fascinating interviews with experts in the field of CCUS.